Hello, everybody, and welcome to another conversation in our series on seeking harmony. Today, we are going to be looking at some topics that have stood out for us during this week. And so, I think one of the things that really did stand out for me was the situation in China with the Uyghurs, and I actually had to go and Google the pronunciation of that name. So it's apparently Uyghurs, and I was like, okay, that's a bit interesting. But one of the things that I actually found in Googling was that they actually of Turkic descent, not Islamic descent. So they actually moved to Islam to Islam as a religion in the 16th century. Before that, they were actually Turkic, and there are still Uyghurs actually in some Turkic countries all today. The greatest majority of them are actually in China, but they are actually spread around the world quite a bit. So yeah, that was something interesting that I found, and I think just from our reading of the article and what stands out for me, the scary part or the scary comparison in what has been uncovered feels very much like the implementation of modern day concentration camps. So I just wanted to check in with you guys how you felt about that comparison, because it starts to make it even more concerning when we consider what concentration camps have historically meant for humanity.
Yeah. I actually didn't think of a concentration camp. I definitely thought of how it was always the same story of minorities being treated by some governments basically that wanted to control them or eliminate them or take their lands. And it's been the same story for 100 years for all these minorities, being painted as dangerous, having propaganda on them, justifying their mistreatment. And yeah, I just thought I'm just over that, but basically every time we have a minority treated this way or an extremist group or party coming into power into a country, historically we can't help but see the parallels with how it started in World War II. So yeah, it's I don't know, historically and spiritually, it wasn't that long ago. And so we still have things to learn about that. And then for Uyghurs, it's even more complicated because there's an entanglement with the workforce or so many international companies. I don't know if you guys had heard about that 1 or 2 years ago. It's okay, in what way in my system am I participating in their detention and their enslavement? So it's definitely something sensitive and quite deep to heal.
Yeah, you were saying that they're involved in, you said the workforce?
Yeah, basically a year or two ago, we had news about how they were forced to work for free in industries, and you know how China is basically the producer of the world for many, many companies. And so there are actually many names of companies that were revealed to have like industries in the very city where Uyghurs were detained and were believed to basically employ indirectly Uyghurs, not even employ, because they weren't paid, to create their products. So, yeah.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, that's good to know. See, it's interesting because the Chinese government has, it seems like it has like carefully crafted a way to try to basically gaslight people and gaslight the world about this, because in the Chinese government's description of some of these like internment camps is free voluntary job training, and it's like a place where you go to escape the dangers of Islamic radicalism, and escape poverty by gaining job skills and learning the Chinese language more. And it's like, I don't know. It's tricky. It's tricky because, I mean, it's probably more likely than not, like just being deceptive about all this. You're calling it by a different name, but
and I think one of the things that we probably need to do is give everybody a little bit of context of why we actually felt that it was important to unpack this topic today, because I think just the report from the United Nations that became such global news, really, that there are now European countries actually asking for the release of Uyghurs in China after the story broke around what kind of human rights abuses are happening in those places. So like, I don't know, just a very high level context feels like it's good, because I kind of dove into their background and their history, but we didn't actually position why we felt that it was important to explore this topic today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was it's interesting. It's that report on the human rights abuses of the Uyghurs in China. It's been in the works for some years now, like several years, and there's been a lot of pressure to publish it or not to publish it in the case of like the Chinese government. And oh yeah, there you go. And so it's been like very, I guess, political, as to whether or not this thing is published. But now it seems like, it feels like now is the time when it's probably the easiest to publish it, because there's already some contention in the world, around China and all of its intentions with Taiwan. So, I mean, on one hand, like, people could paint it as the Chinese government is painting this like UN human rights abuses report as being, Western countries trying to like portray China as being, abusive, basically, and tyrannical, and they're just like, oh, it's just trying to paint us as something. But you could also see it as, it's definitely a time when more countries would be open to hearing that, I suppose, if they weren't already. That was my feeling about it. Yeah. And it was literally, I think they said it was published like 13 minutes before the UN human rights official was set to retire from her position. She's like, well, I'm going to be out of here soon, and I've done all this work, so I better I better drop this now. You know, so yeah, there we go.
If you read what people have gone through that are in these places, they are like concentration camps. Like, it's really awful. It's just horrible, you know, and I really do feel like it is just pure evil, you know, and they're just trying to spin it as like the propaganda they spin is just, you know, completely false. And
Yeah.
like, I guess the question is, like, why does this keep happening, or how does it keep happening that there's like this level of like evil, of like ostracizing a population? Yeah, I don't know, like, but it's evil.
I like
So
that.
basically,
I
I'm
like
sorry.
that question quite a bit, and I think it's something that we've touched on before over the last few months, is that energy of vilifying the other. So anything that doesn't conform to the required or almost enshrined standard is vilified, and in vilifying it, we just the abuse in whichever way is seen to be justified, or tried, or in doing that, trying to justify the abuse of the other. And it's something that you mentioned earlier in our conversation, Yureen. So I think there is definitely something to explore at the core of why does this continue to happen, but what's at the core? What is the core issue here?
What I'm thinking about is like my college history lessons about nationalism, and how it's not actually a celebration of a country's nations, different nations, but more so movements trying to like dignify or empower a population, like a few people, while like vilifying other people. So that's not something that's very new, I guess. And that's something that was at the core of at least World War One, but I think World War II as well. And it was at work for the whole of the 19th century. So that's what I mean when I say I feel like this is so deep. That some countries haven't really learned the lesson yet about that. And it's like everything is the same, it's always the same patterns. So it's not a coincidence. I think to put even more context in our discussion, I think we kind of like suggested it but didn't mention it, like the United Nations, they reported like several crimes against humanity. That's right. And I wonder what were the reasons for the United Nations to like delay this, or like the discussions about like should we publish it or not.
From what I had read about it, I remember there being like, you know, definitely pressure from the Chinese government, you know, not to publish that, which, you know, in itself is telling, because why would you not want someone to publish something unless there was something shady going on there, you know? But I think part of it too was, you know, the person who was doing the investigation was saying that she wanted to like keep keep looking and keep investigating and keep gathering data and details, you know, as much as she could. And she was concerned that when some countries were, like Western countries were pushing for the report to be published, and she felt like, oh, they are politicizing it, and it's going to make it harder to build trust with local people in China, local officials, for her to even be able to investigate it. So I feel like it mainly comes down to politics, and also like trying to root out doubt, because like that would be what she's trying to do, is trying to like make a report that's so definitive that there's not room for doubt. Because if the thing about it is, like, China is trying to sow doubt. China's trying to, like, for every single accusation, there's always an explanation, there's always a story, you know, to sow the seeds of doubt there. So I think that was part of it, but I think part of it also had to do with just not wanting to upset China. But if you guys have any more information about it, I would, yeah, I think that would be helpful. So
I actually don't, but I feel like it's very telling of like the kind of era we're entering, because China is like facing crisis on so many levels. It's like they're backing up kind of a debt, you know, on all sides, and not just financial, which like provoked their economic crisis, but just like a debt in general. And like if you want to go in like spiritual matter, I guess, it would feel like their karma is occurring right now. But yeah, I don't really know much more about like their excuses or why now, you know.
yeah, I think part of it too is that it kind of had to be really, the person who did the report, she would want to, Michelle Bachelet would probably want to publish it before she retired, because she wouldn't want like all of her work to be done and then someone new to come in and be like, oh, I'm going to delay this. And she's like, no, I have to do it. It's now or never for me, you know. Although who's to say if they would not have published it, but I think that that's part of it. But yeah, I also, feeling into like the core of why this is happening, I felt the core of it might be persecution of people. So kind of meaning like wrongfully accusing or going after someone just based on an agenda you have, or something about who they are, or a suspicion. Because to me, it has to do with rooting out any sort of refusal to submit to the government's control, or any sort of form of just, I don't know. I think just being different. I think there's that perception that, I think it makes it easier to oppress everyone if the public is already buying into a segment of the population having rights deprived, or being deprived of rights. And I feel like, yeah, I think that's what it is. And I think there's an effort to kind of undermine any possible resistance to the government, because, you know, the Uyghur minority people, there's the idea that they have their own culture, they might want to have more autonomy, more independence, and, you know, there's always the threat brought up of like, oh, Islamic radicalism, you know, because they're Muslim, you know, Chinese government can use that line, you know. I was feeling that.
So I have a sense of a couple of things happening here, and I feel like one of those things is back to the concept of nationalism and what in the past would have been tribalism. And that there's always been a sense of war between tribes for resources. And there's also been a sense of ostracizing the other within tribes. So it was literally conform or die. And so from a karma point of view, I would say that these are karmic lessons that are coming up again to see if we've actually learned our lesson, if humanity has evolved past that very basic thought process of shame or kill the other. Because technically, tribally, if you were the other, you were ostracized out of, you were literally kicked out of the tribe. So, and those people that were kicked out of tribes generally then started to come together, almost in a manner of creating a level of protection for themselves in numbers. So there was diversity born of necessity, not necessarily diversity born of a desire to know the other. They had to band together to then also fight for their share of hunting rights and all those other things. So there's a very tribal and rudimentary, almost genetic imprint that seems to be surfacing as we start to unpack that history it's almost this constant repetition of these historical lessons of nations going to war with each other, trying to protect their borders, trying to protect their land, trying to take from other lands or nations, or at the very rudimentary take from other tribes. So there's a very primitive way that humanity still interacts, even though we believe we have very much evolved and become civilized. At the core of it, it's still quite primitive.
Yeah, I think so too. And I just want to note that it's not like the first time China has done this, where they've done that with Tibet. Tibet, I don't know how this is pronounced in English, but they've done that with people who follow the religion of Falun Gong, that meditative martial art and dance. All like very, very Pacific nations that were ostracized and vilified. And so now it's like the universe is asking this question, like, how much more can the world take before they put a stop to that for China? And it feels like we're going into an era where we're starting to actually say to different governments and nations that, no, actually, this is not okay. And we don't exactly know how to put a boundary just yet on you, but we'll definitely not keep quiet, and we'll try. And that feels more hopeful, because it means that the things that were born of World War, basically, this is the basic goal of the United Nations, is to prevent these things from happening at a large scale ever again. And so we still have a long way to go. We still have deep-rooted pattern. As you said, that probably we have from tribalism and almost the beginning of humanity as we know it right now. but there's some progress in healing.
Yeah, and I like that you have just brought us also back to the space of there is a sense that humanity, nations, are starting to say to other nations, while we respect your sovereignty, we also expect you to respect each other's sovereignty. It starts to feel like a new global standard is forming without necessarily quite calling it a new global standard just yet. But directionally, there is definitely a sense that there are more and more countries in the world saying, we need to respect life. We need to respect life with humanity. We need to respect life from our planet. And so we need to start managing the resources better. We need to start managing how we take from our planet better. So there's a lot for me, there's a lot of directional tone in terms of there is a level of respect of life that needs to prevail much more than what we have called it out before.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I also feel, besides respecting life and overcoming the tribalism, I pulled this card from the O cards, and it says victim. I know it's mirrored on my screen, but yeah, victim, and then wringing out a towel. And so I feel like the meaning of this would be like, really, this is an experience, and this is something where it helps. It's consciousness is calling in, like wringing the victimhood out of the towel of your consciousness, like if your consciousness was a towel. So, I mean, I really feel like this card is pointing to the energy of like, just because you're, you might be, I don't know, a minority, or maybe have less resources than another country or group of people or something, that you're not going to be a victim. You're going to stand up and claim your power, you know, and you're not just going to accept this, you know, whatever it is, persecution. Yeah. I thought that was a cool how that card just popped up. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah. It also feels like a choice of either we're going to choose acceptance and like accepting ourselves and others, or it's a choice of fear where you fear what's not like you, and that's where the you know, the abuse and ostracizing comes from, is because it's like, oh, you're not this standard, you're not what I know, so I'm afraid of you, and I should be afraid of you because you're different. But yeah, it feels like acceptance is becoming the more worldwide view, and as well as, like Sage, like what you were saying, standing up to the non-acceptance, you know, or the discrimination.
Yeah. Excuse me.
I feel like that's a really good place to transition into the next topic, for one reason and one reason only. You mentioned acceptance, and we've just come into the space where we have heard the result of Chile's constitution rewrite referendum.
Mm-hmm.
And literally in that space, there has been a lot of rejection of bringing in the diverse components and accepting that change, that wholesale change is required. And so my question here, because the Chile's constitution was rewritten in such a way that indigenous people would have been more recognized, that women would have been more recognized, that the right to a life of people would have been more recognized by removing water rights from the few, and various other things in terms of companies having to have more female representation, and the government having to have more female representation, and then also giving the government more responsibility to actually lead social change. And that result showed that literally 68% of the population voted against the new constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question here is, do we feel like there was, and the ask was too much too quickly? Because there was a sentiment in the article that some of those rewrites, while necessary, would have been very difficult to enforce.
Mm.
Was it a sense of too much too quickly? And is that what made people nervous about the significant shift required?
I think so. I feel it. So I just pulled a card for it, and I got the inspiration to do this last night, and I'm like, yeah, fail, the word fail, and then the shepherd guiding the sheep. And that's what I feel, is that this is the fact that this failed by such a large margin. It might be because of, you could say, like, a lack of leadership or a failure of leadership on the part of the left, of socialists in Chile, because, and other leftists, because one thing that I've read in multiple articles is that a lot of the times, like with these measures in the Constitution, local people in Chile weren't really consulted, and people read this and they didn't know what was going on, and they didn't have a lot of input. But representatives were selected, not from any major political parties, though, with the thought being, oh, people are going to like this, but it was only leftists were on the panel who wrote the Constitution. So it felt like it was like very, like, trying to like push it, a little bit, or maybe like kind of grab at influence, like on the part of the left in Chile, which, there might have been a lot of benefit to what they were proposing. There probably would be, but there was like a lack of leadership, as in like actually going to the people, and more so, and being like, what do you actually want, and getting buy-in for it. And it feels like what really happened was people's prevailing feelings and maybe like fears of change, and a desire for stability caused them to be like, no, we really don't want this. Because like we are going through like a kind of turbulent time in the world. So a huge change like that might be seen as like, oh, this could harm our economy or something like that. Mm-hmm. And Chile, I think part of the narrative in Chile, and part of the fact, is that Chile is one of the most prosperous countries in terms of per capita wealth, like GDP, in South America. And there is huge wealth inequality. So it's not like everyone is like, driving a Mercedes Benz, but there's more prosperity in Chile than these other countries. And a lot of people feel like, well, it's because of the system that we have. But I think that there might be some ignoring of, well, also because of the system we have, there's also vast inequality, and some people are kind of left, in terms of like, oh, they're really in need of some help and compassionate support, but they're not necessarily getting it, so I think that might be what happened. What would you guys say?
Well, I think on paper, and I remember when we talked about this and it felt like a huge victory, especially because like there were so many examples of that happening all over the world. On paper, it looked good, and on paper, it was inclusive of everyone, and more leftist people and artists and people of like cultural life in Chile, plus indigenous people. But I think what happened is a pattern that I see very often is probably like, aside from indigenous people, it was still an elite few, probably different than what Chile used to have in the government, and different from politicians, but still kind of elite, at least intellectually, but we're deciding for it. And I think it needs that because the constitution is very heavy and it's work, it's years of work. And they said it was years of work. But yeah, I feel like the healing that we have to do there, especially for leftists, is like actually including more of humanity, because like some leftists, while having good ideas, are kind of detached from how it is truly in life for some people that don't have the same like wealth standards and cultural standards, and the opportunity to learn about their rights, and even the opportunity to think on day-to-day about change when they're just trying to survive. And so there's a huge, like all over the world, there's a huge healing to do about that. And I guess since we're talking about leftists, and maybe needs to detach from its like revolutionary past, because we've seen that change is good, but it also needs to be done in stability. And where we've seen that it didn't work in like socialist countries and maybe in examples of communism, it's that on paper it's ideal, but you can have so much change, like it's not humanly possible and achievable, and it also uproots the life of many people. So people being more informed about like how stability feels and looks like in 2022 may, have voted no massively because of that. And maybe it's for some other reason, but I feel there's a deep hurt there about politics, and wanted to change, but maybe not doing it from a place of complete peace. And again, like when we talked about it a few weeks ago, on paper it looked peaceful and joyful, but like maybe there's something deeper to explore there.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something that's quite important in this process, and it's that elitist space where, good or bad, it's always been very dictatorial. So we know what's good for you, so you will do that. Or we know what's good for us, so we will do that. Or we know what's good for our economy, so we will do that. So it's a very much an energy of dictatorship and control, as opposed to collaboration and transformation. So as you said, on paper, the constitution looked great. And I think it's also what Sage shared around but did we know what the people actually wanted? And it kind of reminds me of Marie Antoinette and the storming of the Bastille. Like the country was starving. People wanted bread, and she goes, "Let them eat cake."
Yeah.
It's like literally completely missing the mark.
Yeah.
If you need the basics and you are looking to survive, you don't want something that is indicative of a celebration. You want something that's indicative of meeting your basic needs.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like there's like a feeling of like, well, this is kind of working for us already in a way, like in Chile, and it's easier to keep the status quo than accept a change that you might really not understand or have been consulted about or have been on board with from the first place. I think that I feel that there's that detachment between like the elite, like maybe intellectually elite or visionary type people, and then the many people. It feels that way. It kind of reminds me of like all revolutionary movements, like leftist movements, were like, yeah, like let's lead the people to revolution. The time has come. People are revolting. Onward, and but then they say, "Come on, people," and they're like, "Wait, you're saying we have to like change all of these things? What are you talking about? I don't understand what you're saying." And so they're like, "No, you want to change. Onward." And then, it doesn't work or something, or it becomes something very different than what they said.
But most of the French Revolution was bourgeois people, like people who were like very rich but didn't have the noble titles, basically.
Oh,
so I think it's a good illustration of your point. Like, it ended up being a constitution of people that already had privilege and didn't know what most of the people wanted. Maybe not consciously, but it still happened. So again, like we're going into like the deep patterns of people. People have to learn, like they're progressive, all right, but like, do they actually know what the people want? And do they know like humanity like other people do? Do they ask if their truth is the truth of everyone else? Just because you have more vision for change than your neighbor that is more on the right side of the political spectrum doesn't mean that you know everything about it.
Yeah.
So yeah. Also at the same time, like I just watched a class basically talking about how we live in a world where resistance will meet you at every point very powerfully when we try to do change in a divine way, or whatever change. So there's probably a little bit about that too, like people being resistant to change. But I think like with the direction of our conversation, there's very much that pattern and that core truth of like, okay, change, but in what way, with what structure? Because like people are not, especially with people that have suffered from dictatorship in like the 20th century, like Chile has been experiencing, I don't think they're up for any more revolution, chaos type of change.
Mm-hmm.
So they're gonna be like, they're strict about what is happening, probably. And we need to meet them there and be compassionate with their choice, because like ultimately it's the people that decide.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now that you mention it, I mean, you like if you take their history, they come out of a dictatorship. And then you have this bunch of elite people rewriting their constitution. And on face value, it sounds fabulous, but it carries the same taste of dictatorship because I wasn't involved. And I feel like that's kind of this component that is generally missing, is that Irene, you asked the question of, do they know what the people want? And my response immediately when you ask that question is, do they care?
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like there might be a feeling too of like, let's just get people to agree to this. They're going to agree to change because they're not happy. Because maybe a lot of people feel, and this has been pointed out too by Jeff in his blog article about the karmic wheel, birth and death, is that a lot of people might feel like not very empowered and not aware of the power and what could change in their lives. So they might be really, they might favor the status quo. And there might be a feeling of like frustration of like, man, I just wish people would just accept this change, but without actually going to them and meeting with them and really finding out what would be the best way to do it and the most compassionate, Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, the fact is people still need to be met where they live.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You kind of need to understand what is actually happening at a very grassroots level. Like, what is happening there? What is the problem? Like, yes, we want to give everybody access to water, but what does that really mean? How does it shift the landscape? How does it change how they produce things? How does it shape relationships going forward? Because everybody has the right to it now, where before there were very strong elites that had the right to it, and so probably had more power. And so probably chose to take care of communities in one way or another. And so the community is thinking, well, if I take something from my supporter, rightly or wrongly so, what do I lose? What do I stand to lose if I gain this? So there's a big component around understanding what the landscape is and shaping a narrative in such a way that people understand but also choose to participate. And also they still, let's be honest, they come from a dictatorship, so they're probably fatigued by people telling them what is or is not good for them.
Yeah, I see this a lot in France, and I can't imagine how much more intense it can be in Chile because of what you just said. But like, as I said, like, I was in a college of political science with people that were very much leftist and wanted change and progress, like many of us do, and then had like a circle of relationship where people were engaged in politics. And oftentimes, like, they think that the change that they want is what the people want as well, because it's, for them, it's a change for the people. It's against another side of the spectrum that thinks only are their own benefits. And so they think that what they have is the grassroots. But what we learn again and again from failure, from change, and like their frustration at the people not meeting them where they propose change is that they're not actually the grassroots. And so until they learn that learning about humanity is not just like science theories, even though like you're very versed into it, but actually seeing how it translates into reality, for many people, because it can shift since very complex. It's different. It's also different from what people used to theorize about like a century ago. Like they're gonna get like the carpet pulled under them until they learn this lesson. For every initiative and every foundation that they try to lay, because they need to lay it with the people.
Mhm.
And it creates frustration, because you're like, why? I'm doing this for you. Why are you not changing? But like you gotta ask, like, are you truly doing this for them? Is it unconditionally loving and supportive of every aspect of the people you're doing that for?
Yeah.
Maybe it's too political, but I think that's when extreme right movements, far right movements come in, because they have this image, even though it's very illusionary, they have this image and this discourse of, hey, we actually understand you, and we're going to visit you where you live and make sure we care about your situation as a poor people, and we're for the people, the actual people of our country and our nation. You know, it gives people the sense that it's just it should be a very healing experience for everyone. And say, like, even though they're very dangerous, like, where are we actually not listening to the people that are not as privileged? We need to meet them, like, not just like organize like things in our own way and wait for them to come to us and participate, but actually meet them.
I think something that you touched on that just struck me as quite important was the concept of being listened to and being heard. And how often does somebody feel listened to or heard when something is done from a helicopter view, as opposed to somebody standing on a dirt road with them, talking to them, whether they change, and this is the thing, whether they go and change it eventually or not, the fact that they're standing there next to them on the dirt road is enough to draw them in already, because you've met me where I live. I think you're going to take my feedback, whether they take it or do something about it or not. I feel like you're there with me. And I feel like that's where some of the less delivering parties tend to win these big votes, because they are on the ground with the people. Whether they change things for the people that benefit the people at the end of the day or not, whether there's those little political rallies where they are handing out T-shirts and meal packets and all sorts of other things are changing things or not, people are seeing them and connecting with them. And that is probably part of a very cleverly structured political game, but it still works.
Yeah. And this was like the opposite. So
in our last few minutes, just quick. So I think that the last topic that stood out was around Russia looking to limit and having limited the supply of gas across Europe. But one of the things that stood out for me in this process was that they've been systematically reducing that supply over a number of months, possibly even a number of years, so that the pipelines that would reach more of Europe supply the least amount of gas, which I felt was very telling in the fact that the gas supply is dwindling faster and faster, and they're saying that there is a technical fault with the pipeline in terms of turbines, and the sanctions are impacting how quickly those turbines can be repaired. And I think it was something like German turbines to be repaired in Canada, and I was like, well, that's also questionable, especially if they were German manufactured. The fact that they need to go all the way to Canada to be repaired is something to me. But I was very, very much struck by the very deliberate feeling of the reduction of the gas supply to mainland Europe, and the fact that there are so many more gas pipelines than we thought there were that can actually be used to supply the gas. So I'm not sure how you guys saw that and what stood out for you in just kind of unpacking that there will be a shortage of gas supplies, but it feels to me very, very manufactured.
I don't know. Feels like still feels like a toxic couple relationship for me. It's like you try to defend yourself and the other gaslight you even more. Something tries to reduce your relationships.
No pun intended, Yureen.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it would not be gaslighting, it would be gas dimming. No more gaslighting.
Lighting.
Yeah. Yeah.
That feels very much like you try to retaliate, but you still have some bounds with your abuser. So he tries to control and single you out even more. And I just hope that we can learn how to get out safely from the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just seems there's always some cover story, maybe, of like that sanctions are impacting Russia's ability to even get gas to Europe. It's not true. It's more like a leverage situation. But of course, like, I don't think that would always be said that explicitly. And I was curious, Irene, if you had any feelings about it, since you live in France, and you have maybe a perspective on what it's like in Europe more so, or is France very affected by that at this point? I don't know.
No.
It's still like 30 plus degrees Celsius here.
It's still very much summer, but I surprised myself this morning saying like to myself, oh, I'm looking forward to fall, even though my electricity bill is gonna be up the roof. It's like I was like outraged by what I felt, and at the same time I was like I had accepted it already. So there's maybe something to look at like that. But yeah. It's, I don't know, like I said, we've been in these situations for many years now. It just feels like an acceleration of it. And if people don't just find a solution about it, like, obviously it's gonna keep escalating. So, that's my thought right now. Probably will change when it gets colder.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, we have reached our hour. So thank you to everybody for the chat today. I think we covered some good ground, and I feel like the gas and electricity thing, and also the drop in the oil price is going to have some impact and probably worth an exploration over the next couple of weeks. But having said that, thank you everybody for joining us, and to everybody that has followed us on our conversation, please feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, and we will see all of you next week. Thank you everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.